of diplomatic skills. The most important of these was the technique known as brinkmanship. His talent in that area was vividly demonstrated halfway through the Congress, when the Russians succeeded in bringing it to the verge of collapse. Disraeli's most effective weapon against the Russians turned out to be a train. The Russians had already agreed to partition Bulgaria in a certain way. Then they changed their minds and wanted more land. And some of the leaders were happy to go along with it. Disraeli certainly wasn't. So he summoned a special train and threatened the Russians that unless they kept to their word, he would get on the train, go back to London and declare war. Well, it didn't take long for the Russians to climb down. And the special train for Disraeli wasn't needed after all. This kind of chutzpah had been a hallmark of Disraeli's entire career, and it now supplied him with stupendous success. As he travelled back to London at the end of the Congress, not to declare war but to resume his normal duties, he must have known that he was likely to get an appreciative reception when he returned to Britain. But he can't have guessed just how warm his welcome would be.
Disraeli returns from Berlin in triumph. There's a procession through the streets of London. When he gets back to Downing Street, huge crowds are waiting there to receive him. His popularity was sky high.
Having been the helpless object of his great rival's scorn just 18 months previously, Disraeli was now back on top. Gladstone, meanwhile, was little more than a quietly seething presence on the edge of the political stage. It looked for all the world as though their great competition had resolved itself in Disraeli's favour once and for all. But their 40-year-long drama wasn't over yet. The balance of power in their relationship would shift yet again within a short space of time, thanks to Gladstone's extraordinary ability to judge and influence the public mood. Gladstone had been keeping a bit of a low profile since the start of the Balkans War, which isn't surprising because his house had been attacked by an angry mob accusing him of being a pacifist and a traitor. Well, now everything had changed because Disraeli had come back from Berlin in triumph, and Gladstone was disgusted with what he thought was Disraeli's belligerent performance on the world stage. So he decided to enter the fray once again, and the best way of doing that was to hit the campaign trail. Gladstone, who was given to a bit of seat swapping, had been the Member of Parliament for Greenwich in London since 1868. Now, though, he set out to capture a new constituency, Midlothian, the part of Scotland that centred on Edinburgh. Even before he arrived in that city, at the start of his campaign, his attempt to win the seat caused quite a stir. As was his wont, he travelled north by train. At every stop along the way, he spoke to large crowds who lapped up the attacks he made on Disraeli and all his works. All of this was quite a splash for someone who wasn't even a party leader. But it was dwarfed by the impact he was about to have in Midlothian itself. What happened here in the great city of Edinburgh in November 1879 is still a cause for wonder, because when Gladstone arrived at Waverley Station down there, he couldn't even get off the train. There was an immense crowd gathered to greet him. And when he did get out, there was a torchlit procession along the streets of the city as his campaign got underway. Over the course of the next fortnight, he would address countless meetings attended by more than 80,000 people. And he didn't waste a single opportunity to hammer Disraeli and his pestilent policies. Well, the crowds couldn't get enough. And I think it's fair to say that the Midlothian campaign changed the character of British politics.
Until then, a politician had not been expected to discuss or to debate policy with ordinary electors, let alone with non-electors, including women. And here you have Gladstone summoning the nation to discuss and to debate the pros and cons of the government.
course, he's not just speaking to those who hear his speeches. All of those campaign speeches are reported in the newspapers. So really, in many ways, this is the first national campaign run by a politician who very self-consciously is setting himself up as a national leader speaking to a national audience.
Gladstone was really enjoying himself by now. No longer bent on retirement, he wanted to push Disraeli aside and reclaim his place as leader of the nation. And pretty soon, a string of events greatly improved his chances of doing that.
1879 sees the worst economic indicators for Britain for almost a century. It's the worst harvest for 100 years. Agriculture goes into crisis. Unemployment is rampant. And then added to this, during this period after Berlin, Disraeli's great strength, foreign affairs, he suddenly seems to lose his magic touch. There's a humiliating defeat at the hands of the Zulus at Isandlwana. There's similarly massive disappointment in Afghanistan. And although both of these reverses are very quickly turned around, they definitely have an impact on the way in which Disraeli is seen.
Sensing that his old rival was on the ropes, Gladstone increased the pressure he was under by launching a second Midlothian campaign. The result was devastating. Disraeli, or the Earl of Beaconsfield as he now was, found that his huge popularity had evaporated. He was now spoken of as a lame duck.
The country was quite depressed, and there was quite a lot of hardship around, and people therefore were not feeling very happy under the government of the day, and a brilliant populist campaigner on a fairly fraudulent campaign swept the country away.
Gladstone had huge oratorical capabilities, enormous energy, much more energy than Disraeli had. And he had this capacity for sensing the public mood far more than Disraeli did. And within 2 years, the British people had forgotten about what Disraeli had achieved at the Congress of Berlin. They weren't interested in foreign politics to that degree anymore. And Gladstone just swept Disraeli aside.
Gladstone's barnstorming handed the Liberals an easy victory in the election of 1880. He was reinstated as the party's leader at the insistence of fellow MPs and embarked on a second term as Prime Minister. This turn of events appalled Queen Victoria, who famously accused Gladstone of addressing her as though she were a public meeting. But the person most seriously affected was, of course, Disraeli. The experience of being ejected from Downing Street for a second time by his oldest and bitterest enemy seems to have deprived Disraeli of the will to live. In March 1881, a year after the election, he caught a chill, it developed into bronchitis, and within a month, he was dead.
Disraeli's final act was to make quite clear that he did not want a state funeral like the Duke of Wellington or something. He wanted to be buried like the English country gentleman he always wanted to be, in a private funeral at his country estate at Huw. This, Gladstone thought, was the final disgraceful sham on Disraeli's part. He didn't believe it. He thought this was a real kind of put-on, really.
Even at the moment of Disraeli's death, Gladstone simply couldn't suppress his feelings. He refused to attend the funeral, which took place here at Disraeli's local church at Huw on the 26th of April, 1881. And he made one final bitter reference in his diary and said, "As he lived, so he died, all display without reality of genuineness." Not a widely held view, and certainly the Queen would have disagreed, because Victoria had this memorial placed in the church. It is the only memorial to a commoner
ever erected by a reigning British monarch. And by the way, it's more than Gladstone ever got.
Once Disraeli's funeral was out of the way, Gladstone got on with the job of running Britain. And on one level at least, it was easier than before.
Gladstone was, in a sense, emancipated from, Disraeli's being there, being a rival. There was no more, he had no rival left really after that. Not up to handling this gigantic popular figure.
With no politicians of comparable stature anywhere in sight, Gladstone went on to dominate British politics for another decade and a half. He served 2 more terms as Prime Minister and remained a commanding presence in the Commons until he chose to retire at the age of 85. Throughout this long finale to his amazing career, he was routinely referred to as the Grand Old Man. But many people nowadays feel that his command of events was never as complete after Disraeli's death as it had been while he was alive.
The basic truth about Gladstone and Disraeli is that they depended on each other. They sustained each other. And at Disraeli's memorial service here at Westminster Abbey, which, by the way, Gladstone could be bothered to attend, the Dean of Westminster called them the great twin brothers of British politics. And as you can imagine, Gladstone's blood pressure went through the roof. But the Dean was right. Gladstone and Disraeli sparked off each other, and British politics was much richer for it. This was a unique double act that lasted 40 years, and it's a fair bet that we'll never see anything like it ever again.
Coming up on BBC4 comedy from those seeking solace at the bottom of a beer glass. It's Early Doors.